a low bar, 3-part rubric for whether or not you should be allowed to educate at any level, really. But specifically, it's one that I developed for college professors when I was noticing that too many of our colleagues didn't meet one or more of these criteria. 3-part rubric for whether or not you should be in front of students at all. You must know something real that you can communicate while believing in the fundamental humanity of all of your students. You don't need to believe that all of your students are equal. In fact, you shouldn't. They're not. They're not the same. But they all are equally deserving of an opportunity to discover what it is that they're capable of. And most people arrive at higher ed having been, in one way or another, failed by their educations to date. Even, and maybe in some ways especially, those students who show up with the 4.0s from elite college prep schools with the, 18 extracurriculars and, having been lauded the entire time for being exactly what the world and their parents and their prep schools and their fancy prep schools want them to be. They too often will show up, and we had those students. We didn't have as many as we would have if Evergreen had been a selective elite private liberal arts college rather than a public liberal arts college, but we had those students, and some of them were extraordinary, and some of them weren't. But too many of them, and of course this would be true, were in no way motivated from their own internal sense of what it is that they wanted to do in the world. They all too often had, yes, maybe discovered that this instrument rather than that and this sport rather than that, but they were better for them. But they had sort of a checklist, and they would too often come into our classrooms expecting the checklist, being motivated by the external carrot and stick people in the front of the room, by the sage on the stage that we were as professors and that all the other professors were. And frankly, most faculty, it's easier to teach to someone who expects a checklist, because all you have to do is generate the checklist, hand it to them. And if they do meet your checklist, then you write them at Evergreen a good narrative evaluation, or at any other school, give them a good grade. And if they don't, then they get a bad grade. That's much simpler than actually getting to know the person and trying, as we did in very many ways. We had a lot of different kinds of assignments by which we tried to reveal to the students that whether they were internally or externally motivated to discover and become their best selves, discover what their passions and skills were and become their best selves. And if they weren't, if they could be revealed to themselves to be externally motivated, how to change that, how to move that locus of control from outside to inside. That is the thing, right? So you were going to say, so I think this rubric is very important.
Yes.
You need to know something real, you need to be able to communicate it, and you need to fundamentally believe in the humanity of all of your students. But that first one, knowing something real, I think doesn't necessarily mean what most people think it will mean.
Yeah, this is crucial. Now, I remember having this conversation with many students who come in confused about a lot of things, right?
Sure.
We had conversations at the beginning of our programs about the fact that the environment seems like a consumer environment where they are the consumer, and therefore they're, that it's a market and that you have the rights of the consumer in a market. No, you're not a consumer of information. You're also not, this is not a pseudo job. You're not producing things in the world that are likely to be important after college. So what are you doing? And the recognition, once you strip it down from all of the stuff that looks like some analog for a job or looks like some analog for shopping, what you're left with is that the real purpose of undergraduate education is the upgrading of the mind so that it is capable of high quality, rigorous thought. Right? Yes. Now, there may be quadrants of the university where that's not a perfect description, but the basic point is you're not really teaching material. Right? To pick up material is useful in the process, but you're really using material as a training ground for high quality thinking, for the ability to detect what a true idea is and what a attractive false idea is, and how you would distinguish the two. And so,
can I just add here? I think as there will be faculty everywhere who, the good faculty mostly, who will be screaming at this. Will say, what are you talking about? And I think, and apologies if you made this distinction, but there really is distinction here between grad school and undergrad. And we found in these full-time programs that we could really go deep with students with in evolutionary biology, and the kinds of thinking that are in A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century really were developed in part in those classrooms, around campfires, in the field, in the labs with students. That said, you go to grad school in a subject to become an expert in that subject. That's what grad school is. And professional schools like medical school and law school, the same thing, right? These are understood to effectively be jobs programs at some level, right? Undergrad isn't supposed to be that. And so whether or not you're a philosophy major or a history major or a biology major, by and large, if you're talking about major, and again, Evergreen actually didn't have majors either, but history professors teaching undergraduates shouldn't be imagining that they're training historians. And biology professors teaching undergraduates shouldn't imagine that they're training future biologists. And philosophy professors teaching undergraduates should not imagine that they are training future philosophers. They are teaching people how to have a life of the mind, how to be problem solvers, how to recognize inconsistencies in logic, how to observe and make hypotheses about what it is that they're seeing, whether or not they think they're doing science at all. All of these things are actually necessary. And you can get there through history. You can get there through philosophy. You can get there through biology. You can get there through, almost all disciplines, with the exception of right. And I was, okay, so who gets to be the arbiter of what's real? Well, a lot of people will agree that a number of the new disciplines aren't real, but there are a tremendous number of ways that you can get to understanding how to view the world. And whether or not you say, or on your diploma it says that you specialized in, you majored in history or philosophy or literature or anthropology or chemistry or physics or biology, you should be able to make similar kinds of assessments about the world, rather than think, I'm 4 years into becoming a philosopher. For some people, that is how they view it. But for the vast majority of people who don't go on to do anything in their lives that is a match for what their college degree says, consider that, we're not actually, college is not actually supposed to be about that tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of people who go on to graduate school in those subjects.
Yeah, and how devastating in an era where we really don't know what the future is going to look like in terms of what people will do for a living, if that's even how it works.
Yeah.
Narrowly targeting some set of information and even skills is a fool's errand, or at least a very serious gamble. And, if you look at what we did, we used evolutionary biology to train minds. If you thought of us as training people to be evolutionary biologists, I think only a small number, 3 or 4 people in our history at the college went on to get PhDs in evolutionary biology. Mm-hmm. On the other hand,
but that never felt like a failure. That was never the intention. And indeed, sorry, I'm interrupting you, but I remember, especially since one of my sort of flagship programs is animal behavior, I would say to students at the beginning of a program, because so many people think they love animals and therefore they want to be animal behaviorists. And the fact is that actually doing the work of animal behavior is, for most people, mind-bogglingly dull or uncomfortable or just not actually what they want to do. And so I felt like one of my jobs was to make sure that those people who really thought this is what they wanted to do discovered now in college that this is not what they wanted to do, so that they could go on to figure out what else they wanted to do. And still, despite that disclaimer that I would give at the beginning, I would have students who would come to me apologetic. I don't think I want to do this for a living. I don't think I want to be a biologist. To which my reaction was always, great, not great, thank God you're leaving, but great, terrific that I was able to help you figure out something about what your future might be, even if in this case it is not this. And these were not students who then said, and I can't be in this program anymore, or I'll never learn from you again. These were often students who then continued to take programs with me, precisely because it wasn't, they were interested in the material. They just saw that what they had in their head as being, a wolf biologist in Montana or something was not going to be their future, but they still wanted to learn how to think.
Right. And, you can see, if you think about, viewers of the podcast will have been through a certain amount of evolutionary thinking here, you can see that although, yes, it is narrowly applied in general to things that meet the definition of adaptive evolutionary dynamics, that a mind skilled in understanding how adaptive evolution works is then a mind that is actually very well prepared to understand things like economics, for example. You may never have taken anything in school that involves immunology. But the fact is, one can directly apply what one understands from the adaptation of creatures to the adaptation of information inside the immune system, and therefore the ability to fend off diseases. So, the ability to recognize game theory, the difference between a complex system and a complex adaptive system, these are things that apply across our lives. And so in any case, it is a tremendous thing to study. Even we had many students who arrived because of enthusiasm of other students, even though they didn't particularly think they cared about biology. And the basic point is, I want something interesting. And it's like, yes, that's exactly why you should be here.
Yeah. We had a number of students, even ultimately in the advanced programs, who would continue to say, I just don't think I'm good at science. I never thought that, and I'm not sure that I'm good at science. It's like, oh, but science then isn't what you think it is. Again, I use this maybe too much, but it's not the signifiers of science. It's not the guy wearing the lab coat holding the glassware or running the expensive scientific equipment is therefore a scientist. All too often not. Quite the opposite. It's the process of science and the intellectual tools that we use to understand what is true.
Yeah, in fact, I remember from being an undergraduate that there was a particular process that was inflicted on undergraduates in biology because too many of them wanted to go on to be doctors.
Right.
And so, effectively the reason to put people through the exercise of learning the Krebs cycle, and I don't mean knowing that it exists, right? Knowing what it does, but the purpose of learning the individual steps in the Krebs cycle is largely non-existent. Right. But it does discourage a lot of people from applying to medical school because they drop out of biology as a major. So the point is, this is really not about an upgrade. It's about the university solving its own problem. And if you were going to...
Well, it's a test of memorization, but also kind of compliance.
Yep.
Right? Like, okay, how many doctors actually need to know, or, professional biologists like research scientists or doctors have to know the molecular details of the Krebs cycle. Some do, and they can always learn it. Very few do. And yet, that, and, for undergraduate degrees, often it was also organic chemistry, right? Which, is vastly fascinating and necessary for those people who are doing the kind of work for which it is necessary. But the way that it was tending to be taught, at least up until very recently, and I just don't know at this point, was very much, again, as a test of memorization. And it was a flaming hoop you had to jump through.
It's a weed out.
Yeah. And why would we, as a society, want to compel the vast majority of people that science is boring, uninteresting, and too hard for them, and thus leave them completely at the disposal of authorities who come in wearing effectively their signifiers of scientific authority, who say, trust us, we know that you can't do the scientific thinking for yourself, so we're going to do it for you. And we see also that so-called science journalists don't have the skills. They may have been very finely trained. A science journalist may well have undergraduate degree in biochemistry or something. That doesn't mean that they know how to think scientifically. Yeah. And that is the argument that we're making, that everyone everyone who emerges from an actual institution of higher ed with an undergraduate degree, with a bachelor's degree, should understand some version of how to actually think scientifically, and understand the power and value of narrative, and understand how art can transform, brains and values. And, making a complete and exhaustive list, fill in your favorite discipline here, is going to be tough. But understanding how to think scientifically is very, very different from, did you run a gel as an undergraduate and therefore did they give you your rubber stamp?
Right. The fact is, you need to know how some system works, something broad enough that if your mind has gotten good at understanding how it works, that when you get to a system you don't know anything about, you can then take the information, which is of course now free, right? It's all available to us, right? You can take that information and you can say, all right, well, how would I sort this out so I know what it is, right? How does this system work? If I know biology, how does weather work, right? Well, that's a complex system without the adaptation. Right. So what would it be like to just correct what I understand from adaptive evolution, subtract the adaptive part, right? That is a very easy process compared to bootstrapping from the beginning based on facts.